I remember the exact moment I knew something was off, and it wasn't because of some grand cinematic clue. It was a Tuesday in late September, the kind of crisp, golden evening that makes you feel like you're living in a postcard. The leaves were just starting to turn on the maple tree in our front yard, and the smell of someone's fireplace a few houses down was drifting through the open kitchen window. I was standing at the sink, scrubbing a cast iron skillet that had seen better decades, listening to the distant sound of our neighbor's dog barking at nothing. My husband, Mark, was out in the garage, which wasn't unusual. He's always been a tinkerer, a man who finds peace in organizing things that don't need organizing. But that night, he was out there for over 3 hours. That was unusual. I should probably back up. My name is Sarah, and I've been married to Mark for 11 years. We met in a crowded bar in Portland, Oregon during a thunderstorm that knocked out the power. He was the guy who kept buying drinks for the whole table just to keep the mood from dying, and I was the one who told him he was being too generous for his own good. He laughed, and that was it. He had this way of laughing that made you feel like you were the only person in the world who understood a private joke. We were the couple everyone envied, the ones who still held hands in the grocery store, who had silly arguments about who would win in a fight between a giraffe and a bear. We built a life together in a modest but warm craftsman-style house in a suburb of Seattle, complete with a white picket fence that I'd always rolled my eyes at but secretly loved. Mark worked as a structural engineer, a job that suited his logical, steady mind, while I managed a boutique interior design firm downtown. We were comfortable, maybe even a little boring by some standards, but it was a good boring. It was safe. So when he started spending more and more time in the garage that fall, I didn't think much of it. He'd been talking about restoring an old canoe he'd found on Craigslist, a project that required varnish and patience and apparently a lot of solitude. I'd bring him a beer, kiss the top of his head, and leave him to his sanding and staining. He was always in a good mood, a little distracted maybe, but happy. That's what I told myself. He was just happy. It wasn't until that night in late September, when I went out to ask if he wanted dinner, that I saw something that didn't fit. He was standing in the corner of the garage, away from the canoe, which was still covered in a dusty tarp. He was holding a small, beat-up tackle box, the kind you'd find at a flea market for $5. It was rusty, the latch was broken, and it was held together with a piece of frayed bungee cord. The weird thing wasn't that he had a tackle box. Mark had never fished a day in his life. He thought it was cruel and boring. The weird thing was the way he was holding it, with both hands, like it was made of glass. And he was reading something, a piece of paper folded into a tight little square. Even from the doorway, I could see his lips moving slightly, as if he was mouthing the words to himself. The overhead fluorescent light buzzed and flickered, casting a pale, sickly glow on his face. And for a second, he didn't look like my husband. He looked like a stranger caught in a secret. I cleared my throat. He flinched, actually flinched, and shoved the tackle box behind a stack of old paint cans. The movement was so fast, so defensive, that it sent a cold shiver down my spine. "Hey, you okay?" I asked, my voice coming out much flatter than I intended. I was trying to sound casual, but the air in the garage felt thick and heavy. He turned, and his smile was too bright, too quick. "Yeah, babe, just looking for a wrench, for the canoe." He gestured vaguely at the canoe, which was clearly untouched. His face was flushed, and there was a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead, even though the evening was cool. "I'm starving. What's for dinner?" I should have pressed him. I should have walked over, pulled that rusty tackle box out, and asked him what the hell he was hiding. But I didn't. Because at that moment, I was so scared of what the answer might be that I chose the comfort of ignorance. I chose to believe my husband, the man who had never lied to me, the man who was my rock. I chose the safety of our predictable life. So I smiled back and told him I'd made his favorite, chicken pot pie. He closed the garage door behind us, and I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the tackle box. I wanted to pretend it didn't exist. Over the next few weeks, the garage became a fortress. Mark started locking it, something he'd never done before. He claimed it was because he'd had a few tools stolen from the neighborhood, but I knew our neighbors, and we lived in a sleepy cul-de-sac where the biggest crime was Mrs. Henderson's cat getting stuck in a tree. He'd disappear out there after dinner, claiming he was working late on a project for work, but the glow from his laptop was never on. The only thing I ever heard from the garage was the occasional clatter of the old tackle box being opened and closed. The sound became like a phantom noise. a secret heartbeat in our otherwise quiet house. Then the letters started. Not in the mailbox. Mark would find them tucked under the windshield wiper of his truck or slid under the front doormat when he came home from work. He'd snatch them up before I could even see the envelope, shoving them into his pocket with a mumbled excuse about a work memo. But I saw the paper. It was always the same, a pale, creamy stationery that looked expensive, the kind you'd use for a formal invitation. And the handwriting was beautiful, a swirling, elegant cursive that was distinctly feminine. I knew my husband's handwriting. It was the scrawl of a man who'd been an engineer his whole life, all block letters and no charm. This was different. This was a lover's hand. I'd catch glimpses of words on the back, fragments that haunted me. The way you held me, and a promise you made, and this is our secret. The paranoia began to eat me alive. I'd lie in bed at night, listening to the soft, steady rhythm of Mark's breathing, and I'd imagine him with another woman. I'd picture them meeting in some anonymous hotel room, his hands on her back, his voice whispering the same sweet things he used to whisper to me. But it didn't fit. Mark was predictable. He was home every night by 6. He never had a mysterious late meeting or a business trip. He was a creature of habit, a man who had his whole life mapped out in a spreadsheet somewhere. It was the contradiction that was driving me insane. The evidence pointed to a secret, but the reality of our lives suggested he couldn't possibly have one. Finally, the curiosity and the dread became too much. One Saturday morning, Mark took our dog Gus for a long walk to the farmer's market. He kissed me goodbye, and I waited until I heard his truck rumble down the driveway. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I walked to the garage, my hands shaking as I tried to jimmy the lock with a bobby pin, something I'd learned from a true crime podcast. It was surprisingly easy. The rusty door swung open with a groan, and I was hit with the smell of gasoline and sawdust. My eyes went straight to the corner where I'd seen him hide the box. The paint cans were still there, but the box was gone. He'd moved it. I spent the next hour tearing that garage apart. I moved every tool, every old box of Christmas decorations, every stack of forgotten vinyl records. I was covered in dust and cobwebs, and my eyes were burning with unshed tears. Then I spotted a loose floorboard under the workbench. It was slightly raised, like it had been pried up and put back down in a hurry. I pried it up again, and there it was, the rusted, broken tackle box. I pulled it out, my fingers trembling. The frayed bungee cord came off easily, and the lid creaked open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded green felt, was a stack of letters. They were all folded neatly, each one a crisp, cream-colored sheet, and each one was addressed to my husband. But it wasn't his name on the envelope. It was a name I didn't recognize. A woman's name. I pulled out the top letter, my hands feeling numb. I unfolded it, and the elegant, swirling script danced before my eyes. It wasn't addressed to Mark. It was addressed to someone else, someone who apparently shared our address. But as I read the first few words, my blood ran cold. "My dearest," it began, "I know you'll never see this, but I have to tell you the truth about that night, the night you found me at the dock, crying in the rain. You were my savior, and I've loved you since the moment you offered me your coat." My mind was reeling. A dock? Rain? A coat? That wasn't Mark. Mark was allergic to wool. He'd never offer anyone his coat. And then the letter ended with a line that made my stomach drop. "You told me your name was Michael, but I know that's not really your name. But I don't care. I know your soul." I felt dizzy. I leaned against the workbench, trying to process what I was reading. This wasn't a love letter from Mark to some mistress. This was something else. This was a letter from a woman to a man named Michael, who was apparently my husband, or someone pretending to be my husband. The story was a tangled web of mystery. I started reading another letter, and then another. They were all in the same voice, a voice full of longing and regret. They spoke of stolen moments, of promises whispered in the dark, of a desperate love that could only live in the shadows. But the details were all wrong. They described places Mark and I had never been, and a man who was romantic, spontaneous, and daring, the complete opposite of the solid, predictable man I was married to. I heard the rumble of a truck engine in the driveway. Mark was home. Panic seized me. I scrambled to shove the letters back in the box, but my hands were clumsy, and one of them fell to the floor. I grabbed it, but not before a single, long-stemmed, pressed rose slipped out. It was dried and brittle, a ghost of a flower from a ghost of a relationship. I was holding it when Mark walked into the garage. He stood there, silhouetted by the bright sunlight, and looked at the tackle box open in my hands, at the letter I was clutching, and his face went utterly pale. The expression in his eyes wasn't anger, it wasn't guilt, it was pure, unadulterated fear. And in that moment, I realized that the secret in the tackle box wasn't about a woman he was cheating on me with. It was something far stranger and more terrifying. It was about a life he was living that I knew nothing about, and a woman who was loving a man I had never met. The silence that followed was worse than any shouting match we'd ever had. It was thick and suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides, and I could feel the weight of that pressed rose in my hand like it was a live grenade. Mark didn't move. He just stood there in the doorway, the afternoon sun haloing his head, making him look almost angelic, which was a cruel joke given the circumstances. His chest was rising and falling too fast, and I watched his eyes flick from the tackle box to my face to the letter in my hand, trying to calculate how much I knew. But the thing was, I didn't know anything. I knew less than I did 10 minutes ago, and that was the most terrifying part. I finally found my voice, and it came out as a raw, broken whisper. "Who is Michael?" He flinched like I'd slapped him. His hand shot out to steady himself against the doorframe, and for a second I thought he might actually collapse. "Sarah," he started, his voice cracking. "Please, just let me explain." "Explain what, Mark?" I stood up, my legs shaking, clutching the letter and the dried rose like they were my only anchors to reality. "Explain why you have a tackle box full of love letters from some woman who thinks you're a man named Michael. Explain why you've been sneaking around our garage like a criminal. Explain why you've been lying to me for God knows how long." My voice was climbing, spiraling into a register I didn't recognize, and I could feel hot tears burning behind my eyes. But I refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not until I had answers. He took a tentative step toward me, his hands raised in that universal gesture of surrender. "I never lied to you. I mean, I lied, but I didn't cheat on you. I would never." He stopped, swallowed hard, and ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I'd seen 1,000 times, but never associated with this level of panic. "The letters aren't from a mistress. They're from a woman I used to know. Before you. Before everything." I laughed, but it was a hollow, bitter sound that seemed to echo off the garage walls. "Before me? Mark, we've been together for 12 years. These letters are dated. I saw the dates, Mark. The most recent one was from 3 months ago." I held up the letter I was clutching, my hand trembling so violently the paper rattled. "This one says June 15th. That's 3 months ago. Were you seeing her before me and during me? Is that what you're trying to tell me?" He was shaking his head frantically now, his face ashen. No, you don't understand. I've never met this woman. I've never seen her face, not once. The letters started showing up 5 years ago, out of nowhere. She just started writing to me, but she didn't address them to Mark. She addressed them to someone else, someone named Michael. I stared at him. My brain, she just started writing to me, but she didn't address them to Mark. She addressed them to someone else, someone named Michael. I stared at him, my brain struggling to process the sheer absurdity of what he was saying. "So you're telling me some woman has been sending you love letters for 5 years, and you just, what, collected them, hid them in a tackle box in our garage, and you never thought to tell me? You never thought to show me? To ask for help?" His eyes dropped to the floor, and the shame on his face was so profound it was almost palpable. "I didn't know how," he whispered. "I didn't know how to tell you that someone was in love with a version of me that doesn't exist. It sounds insane. I know it sounds insane, but I started getting them, and at first I thought it was a prank. I thought it was one of the guys from work messing with me, but then they kept coming, and they were so passionate, so raw, and she was writing about a life I never lived. A night on a dock in the rain? A promise to take her to a lighthouse on the Oregon coast? A song I supposedly wrote for her on a guitar I've never played? And the more I read them, the more I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I felt like I was being haunted by a ghost, by a life that wasn't mine. I sank back down onto the workbench, my legs finally giving out. The rose was still in my hand, its brittle petals crumbling between my fingers. "Why didn't you just throw them away?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Why keep them?" He moved closer, slowly, like he was approaching a wounded animal, because I couldn't. Every time I tried, I felt like I was throwing away someone's heart, someone who, in some twisted way, loved me, or at least loved the idea of me. And I don't know, Sarah, I guess I felt sorry for her. This woman, whoever she is, she's living in this fantasy world. She's writing to a man who doesn't exist.
And I felt like if I destroyed the letters, I'd be destroying the only thing she has. I know it's pathetic. I know it's stupid, but I didn't know what else to do. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time in 12 years, I didn't recognize the man standing in front of me. He looked small and scared, like a little boy who'd been caught stealing cookies. But there was something else there too, something that made my stomach twist with unease. "So you've been living a double life," I said slowly, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Not with another woman, but with a phantom, with a stranger's fantasy. And you've been so consumed by it that you couldn't even tell your own wife? For 5 years, Mark? 5 years of this?" He dropped to his knees in front of me, his hands reaching out to clasp mine. His grip was desperate, almost painful. "I wanted to tell you 100 times, but every time I tried, the words wouldn't come out. I was afraid you'd think I was crazy. I was afraid you'd leave me. I was afraid you'd think I was lying about not knowing her. And I don't blame you for thinking that. It sounds exactly like a cover story. But I swear to you, Sarah, on everything I've ever loved, I don't know who she is. I've tried to find her. I've hired private investigators. I've spent thousands of dollars trying to trace the letters. But nothing. She's like a ghost." I pulled my hands away from his and stood up, pacing the cluttered floor of the garage. My mind was racing, trying to reconcile the man I'd married with the man kneeling on the concrete floor. He'd hired private investigators. He'd spent thousands of dollars. That didn't sound like Mark. Mark was careful with money. Mark was practical and grounded. This was a whole different dimension of his life that I'd never seen, and it was terrifying. "Show me," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. "Show me all of them, every single letter. I want to read them, all of them." He hesitated, and for a moment I saw that flicker of fear again. "Sarah, I don't think that's a good idea. Some of them they're very personal. It's like reading someone else's diary. It feels like a violation." "I don't care, Mark." I crossed my arms over my chest, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. "You've been hiding this from me for 5 years. The least you can do is let me see what you've been hiding. I need to understand. I need to know who this woman is, or at least who she thinks you are." Slowly, reluctantly, he reached into the tackle box and pulled out the stack of letters. There were dozens of them, each one folded with meticulous care. He handed them to me like they were made of spun glass, and I took them with trembling hands. I sat back down on the workbench, spreading them out on my lap, and began to read. The first letter was dated October 12th, 2019. It started with the words, "To my Michael, who I know is out there somewhere, waiting for me to find him." I read on, my eyes scanning the pages, and I felt like I was falling into a rabbit hole. The woman wrote with a passionate, almost feverish intensity, describing a meeting that never happened. She wrote about a rainy night on a dock, the sound of waves crashing against the pilings, the feel of a wool coat being draped over her shoulders. She wrote about a man with kind eyes and a gentle voice, a man who told her he'd never met anyone like her. She wrote about a promise he made to call her the next day, a promise he never kept. And then she wrote about searching for him, about scouring the internet for any trace of the man who'd stolen her heart and vanished into the night. I read letter after letter, my eyes growing wide with each new revelation. The woman was obsessed, no doubt about that. But there was something else there too, something that felt achingly genuine.
She wrote about her loneliness, her isolation, her desperate hope that one day she'd find him again. She described her life in vivid detail: a small apartment in a coastal town, a job at a bookstore, a cat named Luna. And she kept coming back to that night on the dock, the night that apparently meant everything to her. "She thinks you're her soulmate," I said finally, looking up at Mark. "She's been searching for you for 5 years. She's built an entire fantasy around you. This isn't just a fan letter, Mark. This is someone who is genuinely in love with you." He was still kneeling on the floor, his face buried in his hands. "I know," he said, his voice muffled. "I know. And that's what scares me the most. Because there's a part of me that feels like I owe her something, like I owe her the truth. But the truth is, I don't know who she is. I've never met her. And I can't shake the feeling that somehow, some way, I'm connected to her, that we're connected in a way I can't explain. It's like I've been living under a spell for 5 years, and I can't wake up." I stared at him, my heart aching with a confusion so profound it felt like a physical weight on my chest. "What do you mean you feel connected to her? You don't even know her." He looked up at me then, and the tears in his eyes took my breath away. "Because I dream about her, Sarah. I've been dreaming about her for years. I see her face when I close my eyes. I see a woman with dark hair and a sad smile, standing on a dock in the rain. And she's calling my name. But she's not calling me Mark. She's calling me Michael. And every time I wake up, I feel like I've lost something I never had." I dropped the letters, letting them scatter across the floor like confetti. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold them steady. "You dream about her? You've been dreaming about a woman you've never met for 5 years? And you never told me? Are you hearing yourself right now? Do you have any idea how insane this sounds?" "I know," he said, his voice cracking. "I know it sounds insane. I know it sounds like I'm making it up. But I'm not, Sarah. I swear I'm not. I've been seeing a therapist for 2 years. I thought I was losing my mind. I thought I was having some kind of psychotic break. But she told me it might be a manifestation of something else, something unresolved. And I don't know what that means, Sarah. I don't know what any of this means. But I know I can't keep living like this. I can't keep hiding from you. And I can't keep hiding from her." The air in the garage seemed to grow colder, and I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to hold my broken pieces together. "Who is she, Mark? Why is she writing to you? Why does she think you're Michael? What happened on that dock?" He shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with a desperation I'd never seen before. "I don't know, Sarah. I've been asking myself those same questions for 5 years, and I still don't have an answer. But I know one thing for sure. That night on the dock, the night she writes about, I was there. I know I was there. I don't remember it. I don't remember anything about it. But when I read those letters, I can feel it. I can feel the rain on my skin. I can feel the wood of the dock beneath my feet. I can smell the salt water. And I can feel her, whoever she is. She was there, and so was I. And I think I made a promise to her, a promise I broke, and I've been running from it ever since." The world tilted beneath me, and I gripped the edge of the workbench to keep from falling. This wasn't a story about infidelity. This wasn't a story about a secret mistress or a double life. This was something far stranger, far darker, far more terrifying. This was a story about a memory my husband had lost, a promise he'd broken, and a woman who'd been waiting for him for 5 years. And the worst part was, I could see it in his eyes. He believed it. Every insane, impossible word of it. He believed he was Michael, and I had no idea of who that was. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I lay in our bed, staring at the ceiling, while Mark slept beside me like a man who's finally unburdened himself of a terrible secret. His breathing was deep and even, the same peaceful rhythm I'd listened to for over a decade, but now it felt like the breathing of a stranger. Every few minutes I'd reach over and touch his arm, just to make sure he was real, just to make sure I hadn't dreamed the whole thing. but the stack of letters was on my nightstand, a physical reminder that my reality had been fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. I told my assistant I had a migraine, which wasn't entirely a lie. My head was pounding with the weight of everything I'd learned. Mark made coffee, the same way he always did, strong and black with a splash of oat milk, and set a mug in front of me at the kitchen island. The domesticity of it was almost obscene, like we were just any other married couple starting a normal day, instead of two people grappling with the impossible. "We need to figure this out," I said, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic. The heat seeped into my palms, grounding me. "We need to find her, this woman, whoever she is." Mark nodded, his eyes tired and red-rimmed. He'd barely slept either, I could tell, even though his body had surrendered to exhaustion. "I've tried, I told you. I hired people, but the return address on the envelopes is always a P.O. box in a town called Astoria. I went there once, 3 years ago. I camped out for a week, watching the post office, hoping I'd see someone pick up the mail, but no one ever came."
The box was just abandoned. Astoria, I repeated, the name stirring something in my memory. Astoria was a small coastal town in Oregon, the kind of place tourists visited for its charming Victorian houses and its proximity to the ocean. It was also the town where, according to the letters, the dock was located. The dock where Michael had met the woman. The dock where he'd made a promise he never kept. "Let me see the address," I said, holding out my hand. He went to the garage and came back with one of the envelopes, the most recent one. I studied the faded ink, the elegant handwriting that I now knew by heart. It was a P.O. box in Astoria, just like he said. But there was something else on the envelope, something I hadn't noticed before. A tiny symbol in the corner, barely visible, almost like a watermark. It was a small, intricate drawing of a lighthouse. "Do you see this?" I asked, pointing to the symbol. "Is this on all of them?" Mark leaned in, squinting. "I never noticed that. I guess I was so focused on the letters themselves, I never paid attention to the envelope." He went back to the garage and returned with the entire tackle box, dumping the contents onto the kitchen island. We sorted through the envelopes together, and sure enough, every single one had the same tiny lighthouse symbol in the corner. It was so subtle that it would be easy to miss, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. "A lighthouse," I murmured, my mind racing. The letters mention a lighthouse. She wrote about a promise to go to a lighthouse on the Oregon coast. That's not just a coincidence. Mark looked at me, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "You think it's a clue? Something she left for me?" "I think it's a message," I said slowly. "I think she's been trying to tell you something all along, something that goes beyond the letters, something she can't put into words. The lighthouse means something, and I think we need to find out what." I grabbed my laptop and started searching for lighthouses in Oregon. There were dozens of them, scattered along the rugged coastline, each one with its own history and its own legends. But as I scrolled through the images, one of them made my breath catch in my throat. It was a photo of a lighthouse called the Tillamook Rock Lighthouse, affectionately known as Terrible Tilly. It was perched on a rocky islet off the coast, accessible only by boat, and it had been decommissioned decades ago. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the description. The lighthouse had been the site of a tragic love story in the early 1900s, a story about a lighthouse keeper who'd fallen in love with a woman from the mainland. They'd exchanged letters for years, but they'd never been able to be together. He'd died alone in the lighthouse, and she'd spent the rest of her life writing letters to him that she never sent. My hands were shaking as I read the article aloud to Mark. "That's it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "That's the story. The letters, the lighthouse. It's all connected. She's reenacting this old legend. She's casting you as the lighthouse keeper. She's playing out some kind of fantasy based on a 100-year-old tragedy." Mark stared at the screen, his face pale. "But why me? Why would she choose me? I've never even been to that lighthouse. I've never even been to Astoria, as far as I know." I turned to him, a new thought dawning in my mind. "But what if you have? What if you were there and you just don't remember? What if that night on the dock really happened and something happened to you that made you forget?" He shook his head, but there was doubt in his eyes. "I don't have any gaps in my memory, Sarah. I remember my whole life. I remember college. I remember meeting you. I remember our wedding. There's nothing missing." "Memories can be repressed," I said, my voice growing more urgent. Trauma can cause people to block out entire events.
What if something happened on that dock? Something so traumatic that your brain just erased it? Mark was quiet for. What if something happened on that dock? Something so traumatic that your brain just erased it? Mark was quiet for a long moment, staring at the image of the lighthouse on my screen. Even if that's true, he said finally, what do we do about it? How do we recover a memory I don't even know exists? I closed the laptop and took a deep breath. We go to Astoria. We find the dock. We find the woman. We get answers, one way or another. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of fear and gratitude. You'd do that? You'd go with me? After everything I've kept from you? I reached across the counter and took his hand, feeling the familiar warmth of his skin, the calluses on his fingers from a lifetime of building things with his hands. You're my husband, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my heart. And I don't know what's happening to us, but I know I can't lose you to a ghost. So yes, I'll go, because I need to know the truth as much as you do. We left the next morning, driving south along the Oregon coast in Mark's truck. The scenery was breathtaking, the kind of rugged, untamed beauty that makes you feel both insignificant and profoundly alive. The Pacific Ocean stretched out to our left, a vast expanse of gray-green water that seemed to go on forever. We passed through small towns with names like Seaside and Cannon Beach, places I'd visited as a child but never thought much about. But now, every mile felt like a step deeper into a mystery. The drive took about 3 hours, and by the time we reached Astoria, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the charming, historic downtown. The town was nestled on the banks of the Columbia River, with its iconic bridge stretching across the water toward Washington. It was postcard perfect, the kind of place where you could imagine a woman in a flowery dress walking down the street, clutching a stack of letters to her heart. We checked into a small bed and breakfast, a Victorian mansion that had been converted into a cozy inn. The innkeeper, a cheerful woman named Margaret, showed us to our room and asked if we needed anything. I hesitated, then pulled out one of the letters, showing her the lighthouse symbol. Do you recognize this? I asked. Does it mean anything to you? Margaret took the envelope, her eyes narrowing as she studied the symbol. Well, I'll be, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. That's the mark of the Astoria Literary Society. They're a group of local women who meet at the old library. They're known for their unusual hobbies. They write love letters mostly, to famous people, historical figures, sometimes to strangers. They call it practicing the art of devotion. It's a bit eccentric, if you ask me, but harmless. My heart raced. The Astoria Literary Society? Do they have a specific member who writes to a man named Michael? Margaret laughed softly. Oh, honey, they all write to someone. It's their thing. But I don't know any specifics. You'd have to talk to the librarian, Mrs. Beasley. She's the one who runs the group. We thanked her and made our way to the library, a grand old building made of stone and ivy. The interior was musty and dim, filled with the scent of old paper and wood polish. A woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes was sitting behind the front desk. She looked up as we approached, and her smile faded when she saw Mark's face. Can I help you? She asked, her voice cautious. I stepped forward, pulling out the letter with the lighthouse symbol. We're looking for someone, I said. Someone who's been writing letters to my husband for 5 years. She calls him Michael. We think she might be part of your literary society. Mrs. Beasley's face went pale, and she sank back into her chair. Oh dear, she whispered. Oh dear, oh dear. I was afraid this day would come. I knew you'd find your way here eventually. She told me you would. She said you'd come looking for the truth, and I couldn't stop you. Who is she? Mark demanded, his voice tight with emotion. Who is this woman? What does she want from me? Mrs. Beasley reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a worn leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. She's my daughter, she said softly. Her name is Eleanor, and she's been waiting for you for 5 years, ever since that night on the dock when you saved her life. You don't remember, do you, Michael? You were her hero, and then you disappeared. The room spun around me, and I gripped the edge of the desk to steady myself. The letter, the lighthouse, the dock, the rain, it was all real. It had all happened. And the woman who'd been waiting for my husband, the woman who'd been writing to him for years, was the librarian's daughter.
a woman named Eleanor who had been pining for a man who didn't even know she existed. Mrs. Beasley led us to a small, cluttered office in the back of the library, a space that felt more like a time capsule than a workplace. The walls were lined with photographs of Astoria from decades past, sepia-toned images of fishermen and steamboats, and women in long skirts. She gestured for us to sit, and we sank into two worn armchairs that smelled faintly of lavender and mothballs. She sat across from us, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and for a long moment, she just stared at Mark with an expression that was equal parts sorrow and wonder. "I need to tell you everything," she began, her voice soft and tremulous, "from the beginning. But I need you to promise me, both of you, that you'll hear me out before you make any judgments. This story, it's not an easy one. And Eleanor, my Eleanor, she's not a bad person. She's just a woman who's been carrying a terrible weight for far too long." I nodded, my throat tight with anticipation. Mark reached over and took my hand, his grip warm and grounding. I could feel the tension in his fingers, the barely restrained anxiety that was thrumming through his entire body. "We're listening," I said. "We want to understand." Mrs. Beasley took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. 5 years ago, in October, Eleanor was going through a very dark time. She'd just lost her fiancé, a young man named Daniel, in a boating accident off the coast. They were supposed to be married that spring, and she was devastated. She'd withdrawn from everyone, quit her job, stopped eating. I was so worried about her that I didn't know what to do. She started walking the docks at night, just to be near the water. She said it made her feel closer to Daniel. She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she'd pulled from her sleeve. On the night of October 12th, she was walking the old pier near the Maritime Museum, the one that's been there since the 1800s. It was raining, a terrible, cold rain that seemed to come out of nowhere. She was standing at the edge of the dock, looking out at the water, and she was thinking about ending it all. She was so lost, so hopeless, that she didn't see any other way out. She was about to step off the dock, to let the river take her, when a man appeared out of the darkness. He grabbed her arm and pulled her back, and he wrapped his coat around her shoulders. Mark's face had gone absolutely white. His hand was trembling in mine, and I could feel his pulse racing through his palm. "That was me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Wasn't it?" Mrs. Beasley noted slowly. "You asked her if she was okay, and she broke down in your arms. She told you everything, about Daniel, about her grief, about her desire to give up. And you held her and you talked to her for hours. You told her that you understood loss, that you'd lost someone too, someone you'd never really had the chance to say goodbye to. You didn't give her any details, and she didn't ask, but you made her feel seen. You made her feel like she wasn't alone." I stared at my husband, my mind reeling. He'd never told me about losing anyone. He'd never mentioned a grief that ran so deep. But as I looked at his face, I saw a flicker of something raw and unguarded, a pain that he'd buried so deep that even he had forgotten it. "Who did you lose?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He shook his head, his eyes unfocused. "I don't know," he said, his voice cracking. "I don't remember. I don't remember any of this. The dock, the rain, the woman. It's like a blank spot in my head, a black hole." Mrs. Beasley leaned forward, her expression intense. "Eleanor told me that you told her your name was Michael. She asked if she could contact you, and you said yes. You gave her this library's address because you said you were passing through town and didn't have a permanent address. And then you promised her that you'd call her the next day. You said you'd make sure she was okay, but you never called. She waited for a week, and then a month, and then a year. And when she didn't hear from you, she started writing to you. She sent the letters to this library because it was the only address she had, and I kept them for her. I thought maybe if she could just get the words out, she'd be able to move on. But she never did. She's been living in that moment for 5 years." I released Mark's hand and stood up, pacing the small room. My mind was a hurricane of emotions, anger, confusion, fear, and a strange gnawing sympathy for this woman I'd never met. "But why doesn't he remember?" I asked, turning to face Mrs. Beasley. "Why would he forget something like that? Forgetting a person, forgetting a conversation, I could understand. But forgetting an entire night, a night where he saved someone's life?" Mrs. Beasley's gaze dropped to the floor, and she was silent for a long moment.
"There's something else," she said quietly. "Something I've never told anyone, not even Eleanor. The night she met your husband, she wasn't the only one who was grieving. She told me that you, Michael, were crying too. You told her that you just lost a child, a daughter, that she'd been born prematurely and died in your arms. You told her that your marriage had never recovered, that you and your wife had drifted apart in the years since. You told her that you were on the road because you couldn't bear to go home." The room seemed to tilt around me. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest, the air knocked out of my lungs. A daughter. We had never had a daughter. We tried for years to conceive, and we'd had one miscarriage early in our marriage, but we'd never had a child who lived. And we'd never drifted apart. We'd always been solid, steady, united. But as I looked at Mark, I saw something I'd never seen before. A flicker of recognition, a flash of pain so profound that it seemed to age him by decades right before my eyes. "Is that true?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Did you lose a daughter? Did we lose a daughter?" He looked at me, and for the first time I saw tears streaming down his face. "I don't know," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't know what's real and what's not anymore. The therapist I was seeing, Dr. Chen, she said I might have dissociative amnesia. She said sometimes the mind creates false memories to protect itself from unbearable pain. But she also said sometimes trauma can be so severe that the brain completely erases the event. I've been trying to remember, Sarah. I've been trying for years. But every time I get close, it's like a door slams shut in my head." Mrs. Beasley stood up and walked over to a small filing cabinet in the corner. She pulled out a folder and handed it to me. Inside were photographs, old and faded, of a woman who could have been Mark's sister. Same dark hair, same strong jaw, same kind eyes. Eleanor. And next to the photographs was a death certificate. A little girl, born premature, who had lived only 6 hours. The date of death was October 12th, 5 years ago, the same night Mark had met Eleanor on the dock. I stared at the certificate, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. "This is impossible," I whispered. "We were never pregnant. We never had a daughter. I would remember. I would remember giving birth to her. I would remember holding her. I would remember burying her." Mrs. Beasley's face was pale, her eyes filled with a pity that made my stomach churn. "I don't know how to explain it," she said, "but the night he met Eleanor, he showed her a photograph of a baby girl with a tuft of dark hair. He said her name was Lily, and he said she was buried in a cemetery in Astoria. He told Eleanor that he'd come to the coast because he couldn't bear to be in the city where she died." I turned to Mark, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear my own thoughts. "Mark, who is Lily? Who is this child? And why is her death certificate in this woman's file?" He looked at me, his eyes wild with confusion and terror. "I don't know," he said, his voice cracking. "I don't know, Sarah, but I feel her. I feel her like she's real, like she's been there all along, hiding in the corners of my mind. I can hear her crying. I can feel her weight in my arms. I've never told you about her because I didn't know she existed. I didn't know any of this existed." I sank back into my chair, my legs unable to hold me any longer. The world had gone mad. The man I'd married, the man I'd shared my life with for over a decade, had been carrying a secret grief so profound that he'd completely erased it from his consciousness. And somewhere out there, a woman named Eleanor was waiting for him to come back to her, to fulfill a promise he didn't remember making. But the most terrifying part, the part that made my blood run cold, was the photograph in the folder. A photograph of a baby girl with dark hair, a baby girl who, according to the death certificate, had been born to a mother with my name, Sarah. But I had never been pregnant. I had never given birth. And yet there it was, in black and white, a ghost of a life that had never been.